Good evening, everyone. And tonight we are continuing with Eicha Lamentations. We're continuing now with the second chapter. And what we're going to see is, and I've mentioned this before, that a lot of scholars their scholars think that Perek Aleph chapter 1 may have been written after chapters 2 and 4, at least, if not 2, 3, and 4. And part of that is because of the immediacy and the pain of the other chapters. And as we saw, Perek Aleph chapter 1 already has the kind of the theological message within it. It starts with the misery of Jerusalem and then kind of gradually gets to God is punishing us. And the idea of God as enemy, but because we sinned. And it does it in a somewhat gradual way. When we jump into Perek Bet to chapter 2, we're going to see that it starts right off with God is acting as the enemy. God has decided that we are just kind of doomed, almost not really doomed, because this isn't our complete end, but the idea that God made himself our enemy, and it kind of jumps right into it, and it doesn't spare us. And we can understand it very much as kind of a reaction to this tremendous pain. And I couldn't help but think, and I know you're not supposed to draw any comparisons to the Holocaust, but I do draw. I don't know how you cannot with something like this, where so many people came out of the Holocaust hating God and being angry at God, right? It's the sort of thing where here it doesn't quite get to the thing where, okay, I will no longer believe in God, or I will no longer, but there is this kind of God, how could you do this? Right. I know. So, you talk about, okay, so people stop believing in God. I think my family was already in America when the Holocaust happened. My father, though, grew up with a lot of children of Holocaust survivors. And one of his best friends, his parents had married after the Holocaust. Each one had, I believe, lost their entire family in the Holocaust. They married each other. And then his father, who had been a Gerer chassid, had been a chassid of the Gur community, he decided to return to that. He reconnected. And his wife had not bargained for that. Like, from her point of view, that was over. But she was his wife. And so she, that's what they did. And he used to, at every Seder night, she would say, but what about my husband, and what about my children that died? How can you say, what is God, why didn't God do something about them? And she said, when I die, I'm going to go to God and say, how could you? I don't remember like how could you do this? And that was her not believing in God. Like, that was her atheism, just this anger at God. And I think we see in Perek Bet in chapter 2 of Eicha, not quite the same, because it's all wrapped up in God is punishing us, right? But absolutely God has decided he's our enemy. God decided he's our enemy. And we need to kind of draw his attention now to the tremendous pain that was caused to us, because this wasn't right. Innocent people suffered tremendously, innocent babies, which is going to be a big focus of the chapter. Now, before I jump into this very kind of emotional chapter, I do want to address something that came up at the end of our last class and this is not going to be very emotional. This is when we came up with the meaning of the word niskad, right? And we said, niskad, I'm gonna put it up on the screen. We had a very unusual word, and I'm just gonna try and do this quickly because I know that people want to get to the meat of our class. We were looking at Perek Aleph chapter 1, pasuk Yud Daled, verse 14, right? And it says, niskad ol sha'ai biado, right? We didn't have this word sin kuf daled we don't have it anywhere else. And we don't have similar words in Semitic languages. We had to just kind of translate it according to the connection that God wove or attached the yoke of my sins, right? And so the question came up, well, how do we know that it's niskad and not nishkad, right? Because after all, it's a scroll, it's written without vocalization. And of course, this vocalization comes from codices that were written with all of the vocalizations and that little dot that tells us it's a sin and not a shin. So is it in fact a sin? Should it actually be a shin? And what we see, and this is what happens when when a word kind of goes awry, when apparently someone missed something and the word's being copied in different ways. So let's take a look at what we have. One of the things we do is we look at early translations. So here opposite, you see the Aramaic translation, and it says, it's yakir, okay? It became heavy for niskad. So one of the theories is that it was actually the word niksha. It became heavy, right? The yoke became heavy. And there is an idea of sin being heavy. So it was the word perhaps niksha. On the other hand, if we look at Qumran, we have nikshira, it was tied, right? Then if we look at the Septuagint, it says he was kept awake. That's a translation of nishkad. Nishkad, he watched over. That's he was kept awake over all my impious deeds. That's a translation of nishkad, reading the sin as a shin. And we do have Hebrew manuscripts that read the sin as a shin. So this is one of those cases where it looks like that word kind of went in different directions in different manuscripts. And possibly that's why someone wrote it niskad and not nishkad, because he had different words in front of him and he had made some kind of compromise or something like that. Okay, and that's what we do when we're trying to figure out a word. We look at old translations. And of course, if we have other really old Hebrew manuscripts, we look at that as well. So we don't learn much, except probably it wasn't niskad, right? Probably not, just because especially we don't have any real parallels. Okay, back to our text. So we're going to jump in now to Eicha Perek Bet, Eicha Chapter 2, Lamentations Chapter 2, I guess. Now it's skipped forward, excuse me. Let's find it. Here we are. Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, and we're starting right away. And again, if we're talking about that these were all composed of separate lamentations, let's say, you would understand why you would want to have Perek Aleph before this chapter. You would want to have chapter 1 to set up our whole kind of system that, yes, we can talk about God as acting like an enemy as long as we understand it's for our sins. Because chapter 2 starts right in, right? Eicha ya'iv ba'apo Adonai et bat Zion, hishlich mishamayim eretz tiferet Yisrael, v'lo zachar hadom raglav biyom apo. Everyone can see my screen, right? Yeah, okay. So how can it be, or woe, that God in his anger has shamed or brought down the daughter of Zion? He threw her down from heaven to earth. And this is this idea that Zion, that Zion was a beautiful city that everyone kind of looked up to, and now she's been brought from the highest heights to the lowest lows. Okay. Tiferet Yisrael, the glory of Israel, and he did not remember. So, and Tiferet Yisrael is very possibly, it may be referring to the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, because it says that he did not remember his footstool in the day of his anger. This idea that God dwells in heaven and his footstool is Jerusalem or the temple, right? And so he didn't remember that this was a place that he was deeply connected to, right? Instead, he threw her to the ground and took out all his anger on her. Bila Adonai v'lo chamal et kol naot Yaakov haras be'evrato v'tzarei bat Yehuda higia la'aretz chilel mamlacha v'sareha. I'll translate this first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the structure in this chapter. So the Lord has kind of just consumed or laid waste without, and has not pitied all the dwellings of Yaakov. He destroyed in his anger the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. And again, this is a reference to to Jerusalem or even to the outlying strongholds of Judea itself. And we're going to see, we're going to go in closer. We're starting from Judea in a way, or Judah, and then we're kind of narrowing down. He dishonored the kingdom and its ministers. Again, this idea of God was angry and he just cut us down. Gadab b'chari af kol keren Yisrael heshiv achor yamino mipnei oyev vayiv'ar b'Yaakov ke'esh lehava achlas aviv. Okay, so in his anger, he cut down this is a good translation, the might of Israel, and he kept his right hand back from before the enemy. What is God's right hand? God's right hand is his strength, is his military strength. It usually refers to God's military strength. So rather than helping us, he kind of took his hand back. He kept himself from helping us. And at the same time, he set fire on Yaakov. Now, you could say the setting fire is referring to the enemy, but I don't think so. I think that this whole thing is just continuing to talk about God. God inflamed Jacob, right? He just put a fire, consuming fire around Jacob, and talking about, and this is not that unusual at this, we see it much more after the exile, but this idea of talking about Judah, but Yehudah, as if it's all of Israel, right? So he's just consumed the people, the land, okay? Darach kashto ke'oyev. I don't like the translation, he bent his bow, because he drew it like I mean, that's what it means, right? But it's he pulled his bow, he readied his arrow, right? As if he were the enemy. Nitzav yimino kitzar, right? He set his right hand, again, like an enemy, it's parallel. Vayaharog kol machamadei ayin ohel bat Zion. He killed all who delighted the eye. That's generally meaning like kind of the young people. He killed all the young people in the tent of the daughter of Zion. Shafach ka'esh chamato. He poured out his anger like fire. It's simply just straight out. God is acting like the enemy. He's just destroying us. Now, what's interesting also is in this chapter, when we talk about the lamentations meter, dun, 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 right? Where we have 3 and 2, we find it a lot in this chapter, right? Where there's kind of a setup and like, right? We're disappointed. Everything's bad. We're kind of cut off. We have that meter a lot in this chapter. It keeps going, right? Haya Adonai ka'oyev, bila Yisrael, bila kol armenoteha, shichet mitzarav, vayerev bevat Yehuda, ta'aniya va'aniya. God has acted like an enemy. He again destroyed Israel, destroyed all its palaces. And here the question is, are we talking about the palaces of Israel, of larger Judea? Are we coming back to Jerusalem? It's not clear, but the idea is it's using this very wide language for us to think of it as the whole land, right? He's destroyed all its strongholds, right? And there's mourning and woe has increased in Yehudah. What is ta'aniya va'aniya? We actually see it elsewhere. Here's an example in Yeshayahu Chavtet, Isaiah 29, V'haita ta'aniya va'aniya. There'll be sorrow and sighing. The word they're both using the same root that we have here in Yeshayahu Gimel, Isaiah 3. Ve'anu ve'avlu. Anu is used in parallel to mourning. Okay, so it's a word for mourning, for lamenting and mourning, and it's being used in two different. It's a phrase like tohu vavohu, chaos, right? It means mourning. Mourning and mourning, it kind of goes together. Ta'aniya va'aniya, mourning and wailing, but it's meant to kind of to be read together. And of course, this becomes central in keynotes in Lamentations that we read on Tisha B'Av, Ta'aniya va'aniya. Vayachmos kagan suko. And here there's this idea that God did not regard his temple as something that was important to keep. On the contrary, he treated it like a hut that you keep in the garden that's kind of like you just set it up for the season. Once the season's over, you get rid of it, right? So he stripped his booth like a booth in he stripped his booth like in a garden, right? It's as if it's this like booth that's just standing for a little while. Just got rid of it, right? Shikach Adonai b'Tzion moed b'Shabbat vayinat b'za'am apol melech v'kohen. Okay, so we've gone from the Judean strongholds, and now we're talking about the temple. Okay, so God treated it as if it's like, and it's nice imagery, because on the one hand you're saying God treats it like a temporary little hut in a garden that's meant to keep a garden. On the other hand, it's a garden. It was beautiful, right? It was something. It was something that we went to, we enjoyed, we pointed to, and it's gone, right? He's destroyed its its place of meeting, and he has made Zion forget the days of the holidays and Shabbat, when they were joined, when they were gathered together in the temple or around the temple. And he has also operated his anger against king and priest, and we're going to come back to that more later. Okay, and of course that's referring to what happens probably to Tzidkiyahu and the other high up people in the final exile. Zanach Adonai mizbecho ni'er mikdasho hisgir biyad oyev chomot armenoteha kol natnu bebeit Adonai kiyom moed. God has spurned his altar. We have this word zanach, right, and we use it to mean abandon in modern Hebrew. Actually, in biblical Hebrew, it's always used for God leaving his temple, his people, his land, like rejecting. It's always God rejecting us in some way, right? So in other words, it has a bad enough connotation in modern Hebrew, but it has a worse connotation in biblical Hebrew, right? Where it really means to reject, right? God has rejected his altar. He's disdained his temple. He has turned it over to the enemy. He has turned the walls of its palaces over to the enemy, and they sent out a noise. They did it's probably referring to the truah, the sounding of the horns in triumph, right? That we used to sound on days of gathering, on holidays, right? We blow the trumpets in the temple, and now they're blowing the trumpets to celebrate their victory over the destruction of the temple, right? And this is the irony and part of the pain. And we are going to come back to kind of the pain of the enemy mocking us, but that was a much stronger theme in the first chapter. And here, a stronger theme we're going to see is the pain of the innocent. But there's a lot of different themes here. We'll see. And again, we couldn't. I don't think the editing of the book of Eicha would have allowed us to read this chapter first, because it's so harsh. It's so like God just wants to hurt us, and you can't do that until you have the introduction of the first chapter saying we sinned and now God is acting like an enemy, right? Where this is just kind of jumping right in. At the same time, we can absolutely understand it as an immediate reaction to the horrors of the siege and the destruction. Pashav Adonai lashchit chomat bat Zion, natak kav lo heshiv edo mibalea, v'yavel chel v'choma yachtav umlalu. So God intended to destroy the wall of the daughter of Zion. He drew a line. He measured a line. Usually you measure with a line to build, but there's an idea, and you see this a lot in prophecies and in descriptions of destruction. There's this idea that they measure like a straight line to just make sure the destruction was complete, like just to completely destroy it. And that's what we're talking about here. It's an instrument used to make sure that you're to mark where you're building a wall, right? And God did not keep his hand back from destroying. He caused the mourning of the wall and the it's a good translation, and the ramparts. Chel are the walls underneath, it's frequently used simply as a synonym for wall, right? But here, when you have wall, chel v'choma, it's the wall the supporting structures. So together they were miserable. They kind of mourned together, the wall and the ramparts. And I've mentioned this before, how important the idea of the walls of Jerusalem were. The idea, I guess, was, and how horrible the destruction of the walls of the city, what that meant to people. That's a little harder for us to understand today. Tavu va'aretz sha'areha, ibad v'shibar b'richeha. The gates have, it's like they've sunk into the ground. Why? Because they're covered with dirt and ash and everything. They've been taken to the ground. They're covered up. They're all. It's like they've drowned in the land. Ibad v'shibar b'richeha. The bars that fasten the gates have been smashed. The city has been breached, and the walls are useless now. The walls are destroyed, and they are useless. Malka v'sareha bagoyim en Torah. So this is someone who's speaking from the perspective of someone who's left in the city. They're left in the ruined city after the king and the officers have been taken into exile. The king and their officers are among the nations. There's no Torah, there's no instruction. No one's telling us what to do or what we should do. Even the prophets aren't getting prophecy anymore. We have no guidance. They've taken our leaders, and the prophets can't get prophecy. We have nowhere to turn. The elders of Zion have said, these are signs of mourning. They sit on the ground. Yidmu probably has a double meaning. So it probably doesn't mean that they're quiet here. It's probably being used in the meaning of, in Akkadian, it's damamu, which means to wail, right? In Akkadian, it's used for all sorts of wailing, cats wailing, pigeons making noises. But here, so it's probably used, so it can be used for either meaning. It can be used to be quiet or to wail. Here, probably means to wail. There isn't a lot of evidence for being quiet during the morning, right? So, but sitting on the ground is a sign of mourning, and so is, as I say, they put dust on their heads, also a sign of mourning, not just in biblical Israel, but throughout the ancient Near East. Throughout the ancient Near East, these are things that you do as signs of mourning, as you sit on the ground, put dirt on your head. Chagru sakim, they wore sackcloth. Also, fairly in the ancient Near East, they would wear something else in trying to remember where, but it's sometimes called I'm trying to think of it, like a feces garments is where it's called. It's in some places, but for here it's in biblical tradition, it's sackcloth that's worn. So we don't know what other nations did, but there was a tradition of wearing something else for mourning. Okay, the young women of Jerusalem lowered their heads to the ground. What that is showing is that they are no longer proud young women. A proud young woman holds her head up. They have been brought down, and they're looking at the ground. Okay, now we are starting a lament within the lament. Okay, so he set it up. God made himself our enemy. He militarily allowed us to be completely destroyed. The walls are brought down. We have no guidance. Everyone is mourning. Now we're going to have a lament about the death of the innocent, the children. Okay, and we're going to focus on the siege, because that is the most painful. In other words, the author here is the composer, I should say. The composer here is bringing what is the most painful and empathy-inducing event of this whole story, is the most innocent creatures whose pain was not quick or easy, and whose mothers could not feed them. Okay, all right. Kalu badmaot einai harmarmeru me'ai nishpach la'aretz kvedi al shever batami be'atef olel v'yonek b'chovot kirya. Okay, my eyes are done almost with tears. Like they can't work anymore from all the tears. My insides are in tumult. My liver has been poured to the ground. My liver, okay, in the ancient Near East and a biblical thought for most of the Bible. You have this idea that thought is in the heart and feelings are in the liver or on the insides, right? So this means that my feelings have simply just flow to the ground. All right. This is talking about the center of my feelings. Okay. They've just overflowed. I have, Al Shever Bat Ami on the absolute breaking destruction of my people. Be'atef olel v'oneg b'chovot Kiryat. The kind of dying of the children and the nursing babies in the squares of the city. Okay, out in the open, they are dying. But why is it important that they're out in the open? One is that everyone sees it, and it's tremendously painful for everyone. And the other thing is, no one has food, because if anyone had food, they'd be giving it to these kids who are dying in the open, out in the square, out in the public space. No one can help. Okay. To their mothers, they say, where is bread and wine? Why wine? Because wine is what they drank. They used to drink watered down, very heavily watered down wine. That's what they drank. They have no food. They have nothing to drink. They say, they say to their mothers as they're dying, where is bread and wine? As they're languishing, as they're fainting from hunger, and as they're dying, like a dead person, right? Like a someone who has been killed in battle in the wide places of the city. In other words, as they're dying, they say to their mothers, bread, wine, there isn't anything, right? As they pour out their lives into their mother's bosom. Their mother is holding them and they're dying, and the mother can't do anything about it. She knows that they just need food and she doesn't have it. She can't do anything for them. Okay. What can I testify? What it seems to be is this hasn't happened to any other nation. This is so horrible. I've never seen anything like this before. What can I even compare you to, daughter of Jerusalem? I should say the daughter of Jerusalem. What can I compare you to? Your misery is not like anyone else's misery. What can I compare you to and comfort you? Saying, oh yeah, this happened in this other place. No, your suffering is more than anywhere else. Betulat Basion, young woman, daughter of Zion. Because your pain is like the sea. It's unlimited. Right, the sea goes on forever. There's nothing to limit the sea, right? Your pain is unlimited, and who can cure it? We could hope that maybe your leaders could do something. Maybe you could have a connection to God. But your prophets, who should have been there for you, they prophesied lies and meaningless things. And they didn't tell you about your sin so that you could do teshuvah, so that you could repent. They just what they prophesied was all deception, right? Now, if we compare this, we see this very much in the book of Jeremiah, of Yirmiyahu, right? Where over and over Yirmiyahu has to deal with these false prophets who keep saying, hey, we're going to be freed from the yoke of Babylon. Everything's going to be amazing. And there are numerous prophets who say this. And that's what it's referring to, right? Where prophets are saying, hey, everything's going to be great. We just need to rebel against Babylon. Okay. And they lied. So where can we turn now? Safku alayach kapayim kol ovrei derech, shaku vayaniu rosham al bat Yerushalayim. So all these movements can be interpreted as either in shock and horror or mocking. We see that in both. I think because it's supposed to be people who are walking by, it's supposed to be more in shock and horror, right? So they clap their hands. All the people who are traveling, who see Jerusalem, they're passing by Jerusalem, they whistle and they shake their heads. over the daughter of Jerusalem, and they say, Hazot ha'ir sheyomru klilat yofi masos l'chol haaretz. Is this the city that they said was perfect in beauty, the joy of the whole land? And now look at it. Septuagint, by the way, translates klilat yofi as a crown, right? A crown of beauty. That's if that's what it means, it's an Aramism, because it's an that's what you would have in Aramaic. However, you have Khalil meaning perfect all over biblical Hebrew, so it probably means perfect in beauty, right? Perfect in beauty, the joy of all the land. And look what happened, and all the travelers can see this; they remember. And now we get to the mocking. It's clearly mocking. All your enemies, they kind of open their mouths against you. They whistled and they gnashed their teeth. Yacharkushen is always mocking. Gnashing their teeth is always like a mocking, mean thing. Amru bilanu ach ze hayom shekivinuhu matzanu ra'inu. Said, we've destroyed. This is the day that we hoped for. We found them, we found it, and we saw it, right? We were just hoping for the destruction of Jerusalem, and now we've gotten there, right? And then we go back to God and the idea of like this was all from God, and what does that mean, right? Asa Adonai asher zaman bitza emato asher tziva mimei kedem haras v'lochamal v'samach alayich oyev herim keren sarai. God did what he planned. He actually put into action what he said that he commanded from days of yore. What are the days of yore? Almost certainly, we're talking about chapters in Deuteronomy, either the curses or Hazinu, the song of, which is a prophecy, which is when you rebel, this is what's going to happen to you. Okay. So this was all, God said he was going to do this, and that's what he did. He destroyed and did not have pity. Haras v'lo chamal. V'yisamach alayich oyev herim keren tzarayich. And he made the enemy happy over you. He raised the might of your enemies. So this was all from God. Your enemy is like, ha ha ha, look, this is what we wanted, this is what we did. It's all from God. And at this point, okay, we're talking about God made himself an enemy, God made himself an enemy. God is just did what he promised. He didn't have pity though. God did what he said. He did exactly what he said, and he had no pity. Okay. And now we're going to come back to arousing pity. So now we want to say, God had no pity, but now is the time for pity, right? Sa'ak libam el Adonai chomat bat Zion, horidi kanachal dim'a yomam v'layla, al titni fugat lach, al tidam bat einech. So they cried out their hearts to God, wall of Zion, let your tears pour like a river day and night. Don't stop. Don't let it stop. Don't give your eye. Don't let your eyes rest. Just keep crying. Komi roni balayla lirosh ashmurot. Arise and cry in the night at the beginning of every night shift. In the Bible, so the night is divided into 3 shifts. First shift, middle shift, morning shift, right? So you should be crying all the night. At the beginning of every shift, you should be crying. Cry all night. Shivchi kamayim libech. Pour your heart like water. Nochach pnei Adonai si'ir lev kapayich al nefesh olayich hatufim b'ra'av b'rosh kol chutzot. Before before God, right? Raise your hands. This is the standard kind of posture of prayers, that you open your palms and raise them up, and that's what you should be doing. You should be praying to God over the lives of your babies, of your children who are dying, who died of hunger at the head of every of all the streets, all the outside streets had kids dying of hunger. Okay, and we're going back to that. That is, they're innocent. They're innocent. This is an issue of there was no pity. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I have a few questions about like the words he's using. Like, for example,
Yeah.
Roni, I thought usually it means something more positive, like Roni v'simchi b'tzion.
No, there are plenty of times when it doesn't mean that. I mean, I can't tell you exactly. I can look and see and give you some examples, but it's not, and also of course it's clear here that it's negative. I mean, there's no.
Yeah, of course. No,
Yeah,
I'm trying to think if maybe one of the words he's using, like also Asa Hashem kasher zaman, maybe it's like allusions or pointing out to other verses, like at that
I
time
hear
you
what
were
you're
happy,
saying.
now you're going to cry for another reason. At the time you cried, like it's.
Right.
You think it's on purpose? The same words?
There are places that there are very clear parallels. I wasn't actually looking for every parallel. Let me see if there's something specific for Roni. In Yirmiyahu, we have this a lot. So we have well, this is Val Tisa Badam Rinau Tefillah, right? So this is interesting because it gives us that meaning of prayer. So maybe that's why we're using the word Roni to here, which is a little unusual because it's more, it's closer to prayer, that you can pray in joy or pray in sadness. So we have it mainly in Yirmiyahu and in Tehillim also to use for that. But maybe the meaning is more because of the prayer aspect, and that's why we have Roni here, and that's why we're using that word, because it's supposed to remind us of prayer rather than simply wailing. So yeah, thanks for that. So Re'eh Adonai v'habita l'mi olal tako im tochal anashim piryam olalei tipuchim im yeharei b'mikdash Adonai kohen v'levi. Okay, now we have a few things happening in one, right? So look at God, who you did this to, right? And here we're going to have two horrible things. If women eat their fruit, the children that they have born successfully, that they were they bore them healthily and they've eaten them. And here it doesn't seem to mean that they didn't kill them and eat them. The babies died, the kids died, and then they're like, we have no food, we have no choice, we have to eat them, right? And if there would be killed in the temple of God, a priest and a prophet. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. Okay, so the idea is that the temple is supposed to be a sanctuary, right? You're supposed to be able to run there and be safe. And so to kill a priest and a prophet in the sanctuary, that's horrible. Like, they had no place to run, and they were killed. So I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Let's talk a little bit about women eating their kids. Okay, so if you pay attention on Tisha B'Av, we have a lot of we have a reference to a different story when we talk about this. Again, here is talking about women are eating their children, and the reason it's not like, if the women were killing their children and eating them, it would have been said differently. Here it really seems, because the main thing is the babies died. Right, the babies died of hunger. They were calling to their mothers, and mothers couldn't do anything. And then the next step is there's nothing to do. The baby is dead, and this is a theme, not certainly in biblical prophecy, to a certain extent also in other ancient Near Eastern texts, that in a siege, this is the horror of a siege, of a woman eating her own children. Let's look at our parallel where in Dvarim, in Deuteronomy, right, where this is the punishment. Haraka b'cha v'anuga shelo nistachaf chaf ragla hatzeg al haaretz. They have tender and dainty, but the meaning is she's rich, she's wealthy, she's never done a day's work in her life, right? She didn't have to walk on the ground, because she's been so kind of pampered. She's actually going to begrudge her husband and her son and her daughter, and then this is pretty gross, right? She's going to have nothing, to the extent that she will be eating her own afterbirth and her own children, right? She is going to eat them in secret. In the desperate situation you will find yourself in when those enemies are at your gates in a siege, right? In other words, in a siege, right? That these women who wouldn't even set their feet on the ground, they are going to be eating their own children because there's nothing, right? That is the punishment that is promised in Dvarim Deuteronomy 28, okay? This is in the curses, all right? But of course, we also have the story in Melachim Bet in 2 Kings, all right? And this is a story not told about Jerusalem and not told about the exile of Jerusalem. No, it's told about Samaria, and this is under Yehoram ben Achav, right? And he ruled from 851 to 842, approximately, BCE. And this is the story where there's a great famine. Why is there a famine? Because Aram is besieging the city, right? So they are under siege, and the king of Israel, who I've taught this before. I don't know if any of you remember it, but he is actually being portrayed as a pretty good king, right? Because he's walking on the city wall. He's not hiding from the people. He's walking on the city wall to see what's going on. And a woman calls out to him to help. And he says, God should help you, but I can't do anything, right? What am I supposed to do? There's no food, right? And he says, you know what? What's the matter, right? And she says, I made a deal with another woman. She was like, kill your son, we'll eat him today. And then I'll kill my son, we'll eat him tomorrow, right? And so we cooked my son and ate him, and then now she won't give him us. What kind of, now, I've said this before, in biblical, when you go to a king in biblical Israel, right? Why do you go to a king for justice? You go to a king for justice if it's a situation where a normal court is going to put a ruling that will not be just, right? So, a woman's like this is the fake, right? The wise woman of Tekoa, she goes to David, right? I had two sons, one killed the other, and now they want to kill my remaining son for murder, but then I'll have no sons. That's not fair. That's not right. So here she's like, who can I go to? Who can help me settle this thing with this deal that I made, right? We'll go to the king, right? Well, I'll go to the king to help me and to see justice is done because she owes me her son, right? And of course, the son's answer is the king's answer is, I want the head of Elisha. He blames the prophet. He's like, I want that prophet dead, right? That is the king's response. He, of course, is not going to help her get a kid killed, but that's the idea. And so this story is the one that's brought, when we say Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, this is the story that's referred to as a woman killing her child so that she has something to eat in a siege. We don't have that actually, and that's why I'm bringing the story. That's what we're referring to frequently when we say our Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, but that's not what is in Eicha. What is in Eicha is being hinted to in Eicha in our book of Lamentations here is that they are starving and their child is dead and they have no choice, right? Now I do want to say, we don't know if this actually happened anywhere, right? In other words, this is a theme in Lamentations within the Bible and outside it. Was this something that happened? Was cannibalism something that really happened in these situations? We don't know for sure. We don't know.
Who's supposed to be the king in the Elisha story?
He's supposed to be Yehoram ben Achav.
Okay.
Okay. But he's purposely, I think purposely anonymous in that story. They don't name him. They just say the king, right? And he is, again, he's really, I felt that he's portrayed pretty positively in that story in general, where he cares about the people. The reason he's angry at the prophet is because look at what my people have come to. Look at what they've come to. And it's the prophet's fault somehow. So like that's kind of, that's that story. So now let's go to the next, to the if we're going to say, like, because a lot of times you say, well, what were they supposed to do? What else could they have done? I know that I have read at least accounts in terms of Holocaust survivors that they did not eat. They did not have cannibalism in the camps, even though they were starving to death and there were bodies there, they did not eat them, right? So like there is, just because there are bodies there and people are starving doesn't mean that there's cannibalism. So we don't know if this actually happened or not, right? If that's what people were doing, or if it was close enough to happening that this was something that I mean, it's because why am I saying that maybe that didn't necessarily happen? Because it's a theme in Lamentations in general in the ancient Near East. Like it's a literary theme that's used. Okay, certainly the children were dying in the siege. Like that makes a lot of sense. And we're going to come back to that in a bit. And now I want to say, Im yareg b'mikdash Hashem kohen v'navi. If a priest and a prophet are killed in the temple. So Chazal, the rabbis, when they're looking at the story, they're like, and Midrash, they're like, okay, who could this be? Why would a prophet be in the temple, right? Only priests should be in the temple. This must be referring to Zechariah, who we read about in Divrei Hayamim in Chronicles, okay? Here in 2nd Chronicles, we don't read about him in Kings. He's not there, okay? Again, this is a guy that comes up again and again in the Lamentations we read on Tisha B'Av. So here in 2nd Chronicles 24, Divrei Hayamim Bet Chaf Daled, okay? We have in the time of Yoash, so that's 836 to 797, right? But this is towards the later part of his reign, right? When he I'm gonna get to the good part, okay? Yoyada, who is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, dies, and then bad things happen, and Zechariah, the son of Yoyada, goes and prophesies, and they stone him in the courtyard of the temple, right? And so the interpretation, the Midrash on these verses of Eicha is like, what is it talking about? It's talking about this terrible sin that they did, that they killed Zechariah, who is priest and prophet, both priest and prophet, and they killed him in the temple precinct. And that's what it's talking about. Now, that isn't pshat on the level of plain meaning of the text. That's not what it's talking about. Also, in the Midrash, this Zechariah, the son of Yoyada, becomes conflated with the Zechariah ben Iddo, right? And they start kind of merging the people, right? They're not the same guy, obviously, because Zechariah ben Iddo is the beginning of the second temple period. He's the part of Shivat Zion, return to Zion, and this guy is in the first temple. But I just want you to know that, because that's something that becomes Zechariah, the death of Zechariah in the temple becomes a big theme for the horrible sin that could happen, right? And in terms of, this is the ultimate disrespect to God's word. You killed a priest and a prophet in the temple, and that is a reason for this horrible punishment. That helps one understand the horrible punishment. But if we come back here, so you could say, if you're reading it that way, then you say, well, how did we come to this, that women eat their own children who have died? Because how did we come to the idea that a person who was both priest and prophet could be killed in the temple precincts? Both of them are impossible. Both of them are horrible. Well, you did this. Now you're coming to the other. You killed the priest and prophet in the temple. Now you're coming to the fact that women are eating their babies. Okay. And that's the way the Midrash is going to interpret it, and we'll see it interpreted in many of the prayers around Tisha B'Av. However, the plain meaning is both of these things are happening in the destructive. Okay. And we're getting to the end. I know we're almost out of time. Shachvu le'eretz chutzot na'ar v'zaken b'tulotai u'bachurai naflu b'charev harakta b'yom apecha tavachta lo chamalta. They lie in the ground. They lie in the again, the broad places in the streets. They lie in the streets, young man and old. So this is, I think, the contrast. The young and the old die of hunger, right? and my young women and my young men died by the sword. Naflu b'char, they died by the sword. So the old and the babies, they died of hunger, they're at home. The young women and young men, why young men were on the front lines, but young women and young women, they were killed by the sword. You, God, killed them on your day of your wrath. You slaughtered and you did not have pity. Again, this idea that it's God who did it. Tikrach yom moed migurai misaviv. You called like a festival day, it's either my neighbors from around or those I feared from around, like those enemies that I feared from around me. Depending on how you read migurai or migurei, it depends how you read that word. It depends how you're understanding that word, rather. V'lo haya b'yom af Hashem palit b'sarid, and there wasn't on the day of God's anger any remnant. And the day of God's anger here is hinting to this idea of the day of the Lord, right? The day of the Lord is supposed to be when our enemies are defeated, right? But here, the day of the Lord, the day of God's anger was turned against us, and we had no remnant. Asher tipakti v'ribiti oivi hiram. Those that I bore and who I raised, my enemy destroyed, completely destroyed. And that's where we stop in this chapter. Now, in general, each of these chapters is their own lamentation. All this chapter was pain and distress, right? We had a chapter, there's no hope at the end. There is a look, God, what you did. You did this, God. Look what you did. Look what you did. How did we get here? The babies did nothing. Look what you did, God. And that's how we end. We started that way and we end that way. Okay. Now, as we look at the work as a whole, right? This is what Eicha is taking us through, right? Again, that's why this chapter had to be the second. It couldn't be the first. It certainly couldn't be the end, right? There is no hope in this chapter, right? There is just pain. There is just pain and betrayal. Is there an acknowledgement of sin? Yes. Yes, there's an acknowledgement of sin, but that's not the point. The point is God did this. God, you had no mercy. Shouldn't you have mercy? Shouldn't you have mercy? Look what happened, right? And this is I think of it as an outpouring of angry grief right after the disaster, right? And so we needed Parak Aleph, the first chapter, to set up God was acting like the enemy because we sinned terribly and we didn't repent. We sinned terribly. God did terrible, and then God did terrible things, right? And God just tied us to our sin. That was what was going on, and it's horrible. And look at what happened to us, right? And then chapter 2 is just all look at what you did. Look at what you did. You were our enemy. Look, and the babies, right? And then we're going to come in the next chapter where we have a switch in perspective that we even in Perek Gimel in chapter 3, we're going to have a switch in perspective that I grew up where the tune changes, right? There's a special tune for reading the third chapter of Eicha because that perspective, all of a sudden, Ani Hagever, I'm the person, and we're switching to a personal view. I'm a person, and I will tell you how I am dealing with this, right? What I think, and I have suffered, and this is what I do, right? And it's on the one hand, making the pain personal, and on the other hand, making it part of the pain of the individual. So we'll talk about that next time, but I do, again, there are different ways of reading Eicha. And I do think, I think you can read it both as individual lamentations that are put together and as a work that is building something, right? That's taking us through a certain recognition and feeling the pain, because we're supposed to, when we read these chapters, we're supposed to feel the pain. That is the point. That is at least part of the point. So any questions on that very positive, happy note?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if we go back to that pasuk about the mothers eating their children in the same pasuk
Yes.
as the Navi and the
Yes.
and the I, pardon my disrespect, but I'm wondering if
Right.
I guess we can attribute to Chazal that midrash. I wonder if they were aware of how annoying they were being, because clearly they are going against the pshat. The pshat is very, very strong here. They're talking about God is our enemy. It's everything he is doing here is unnatural. The fact that a Navi and a Kohen is being murdered in the Mikdash, that is unnatural. But that's the act of the enemy, just as a woman eating her own child is the act of the enemy.
Well, I'll tell you what it does solve. Okay. It solves that the whole priest and prophet thing seems to come out of nowhere. We're talking about babies dying in the street, and all of a sudden priest and prophet killed in the temple. Like what? And then we're back to people dying in the street from hunger, right? So this little piece, it doesn't make sense in context. It's weird. It's weird that it's there. So
it does make a certain amount of sense, because what they're saying is what is happening is unnatural. That a priest and a Kohen should be murdered in the temple, that's unnatural, just as a woman eating her baby is unnatural.
I 100% agree.
And it just sort of reminds me of what, unfortunately, rabbis have been trying to do throughout history, and that's trying to explain the unexplainable, just as you have rabbis today who try to explain that the Holocaust happened because of this sin or that other sin.
Well, I'm not even going to get into those, but like,
but it's sort of it seems like a relative here.
Look, in the first chapter, we have that in the plain meaning of the verses, right? Where yes, this happened because we sinned. Straight out, it's there. So if you can want to read this as saying, okay, this is hearkening back to that, right? That this happened because we sinned. And again, this priest and prophet slain in the temple, it's coming out of nowhere in the middle of a whole thing about babies dying, right? Babies and old people. Like this continues the idea of the babies dying. This priest and prophet slain in the, yes, I do think that's the plain meaning. Like I think what you said is the plain meaning. They're both unnatural, horrible things that are happening. But if you're saying, oh, who could be, and also there's sometimes I'll tell you the truth. There's a much more annoying midrash, right? Or rabbinic interpretation that I really can't stand, which is the idea that Eicha was written by Yirmiyahu as a prophecy, or most of the chapters of Eicha were written by Yirmiyahu as a prophecy, and that was the scroll thrown into the fire, right? And I'm like, that ruins everything. That this is a prophecy and not a reaction. It takes the heart out of the entire scroll, our entire book, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, but the what they want to say is, well, it was all prophesied. It all happened as it was prophesied. And if they'd only listened, they could have stopped it, right? And here it's part of like, and I do think it's like, okay, so what does this have to do with the priest and prophet being killed in the temple? Oh, but Zechariah was both priest and prophet, right? And so I can see it's annoying. You know, it's annoying. There's so many annoying. There's so many places where they're trying to do one thing, and I don't see the need for the thing they're trying to do, and so it's very annoying for me, right? Like there's like the whole midrash about David's birth, where it's just this horrible story with his father and his mother, and his father was doubted his mother, and his mother had to live on her own. Like it's just this horrible story. And it's like, why did you do this? And the reason is because it's a story that teaches you not to judge people. It's a story that's meant to teach you not to judge people. But it also is this very painful story that if you took it seriously, like I once heard someone repeat it literally like she believed this is where David came from. This thing where the father thought the mother cheated and and she's like, no, and this whole thing. And it was just, it's just a miserable story if you're taking it literally. But the point was they wanted to say you can't judge people, right? So here, they have their own points. They have their own things they want to make. I mean, I understand that it's not the plain meaning. It's not the plain meaning. I'll tell you the truth. Seeing it in context for me, like now, where I'm really just like looking at it in context, I understand why they're like, oh, this is the perfect explanation. Like this really works because this part of the verse is out of place, and now it explains it completely. Now I'm not saying this is their only interpretation, right? But this, right? How could this happen? Well, how could this other thing happen, right? It's midrash. It's midrash. So like sometimes you can look at both, and just.
I think if you had to summarize Eicha, and I think that there's poetic genius in this, that you have two conflicting trains of thought that are irreconcilable. One train of thought is we have sinned, and whatever is happening to us is a punishment for that sin. And the other conflicting train of thought is no sin that we possibly did could in any way explain what is happening to us. And as I see it, all of Perek Bet is in the second train of thought, that whatever is happening here cannot be explained by any of our sins.
Right. I would agree up to a point. Like I would agree up to a point. I think that it is absolutely saying it. I don't think, because again, we're used to this idea of complete personal, like what I do is what comes back to me. But in general, I mean, it was much more widely accepted at this time, and by in let's call it biblical thought, this idea that what some people do in the nation brings consequences for the whole nation, right? So this idea there's this idea of God, yes, you're punishing us the way you promised to punish us, but you didn't have mercy. You could have had mercy. You didn't have to take it this far. Like it didn't have to go this far. So it's like what you're saying. I'm not sure, like in again, once you get to the Second Temple period, and once you get to the destruction of the Second Temple, and you look at a book like Fourth Ezra, he says it pretty much straight out. It's like we didn't do anything this bad, right? We didn't do anything this bad. Like the other nations were much worse, and they're not getting this. Why are we getting this, right? And there's pretty much straight out. I think that you do have this idea in Eicha, but it's a frequently expressed in a slightly softer way, in the terms of you had no mercy. You could have had mercy, and you had no mercy. Yes, we sinned, but you had no mercy, right? And that's the thing, and that's the way. And that also allows, like, and again, and I do think, and I think you're right in terms of looking at this chapter. There's never this kind of, I'm going to step back and say, oh, but we sinned. There's like a little reference to, like, that's not the point. The point isn't that we sinned. The point is, look at what you did, right? Look at what you did, and it's a whole chapter of that. It's a whole chapter of that, without a break, really, without a break, and without letting up, and ending the same way it started, or worse, really worse. So any other comments or questions? Well, thank you, everyone. I know that was very cheery, but that's the book, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Yes.
I'm convinced that the reason that we're studying Eicha right now, that we're learning Eicha right now, is because with the wonderful state that the country is in right now, you had to come up with something to cheer us up.
Yeah. I just stopped following the news. I just don't follow the news anymore.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Good strategy.
Well, yeah.
Thanks,
okay,
Miriam.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.